In this presentation, we will take a look at multiple choice questions related to governmental accounting, going through those questions and then practicing test-taking skills with them. First question, an annual lease payment on an unpaid lease obligation journal entry for the governmental activities accounts will include either A, debit to lease obligation expense, B, credit to lease obligation payable, C, debit to lease obligation payable, D, a debit to expenditures, principal of lease obligation. Let's go through this again using the process of elimination. An annual lease payment on an unpaid lease obligation journal entry for the governmental activities accounts will include. So when we're thinking about the governmental activities, we're thinking about the entity as a whole. Governmental activities, we're thinking about an entity then that will have a normal accrual basis as opposed to the modified accrual, which will typically be seen in most of the funds, the largest group of funds, those being the governmental funds. So this is what we would expect then. So what we would expect when we make the lease payment is we're going to credit cash, you would think, and then we're going to debit something. Now we're going to assume this is a capital lease. So we're going to be debiting most likely a lease obligation payable, a liability type of account, something we would do on the governmental activity, something we wouldn't do in the fund activity because the payable wouldn't be there on a modified accrual basis because it wouldn't have the long-term liability. So knowing that, let's go through it again. We're going to have a debit to the lease obligation expense. Now, you might think that we'd have a debit to lease obligation expense, but we're typically thinking that we're paying off a capital lease in this case, meaning we had the lease because we purchased basically an asset through a lease agreement. So we could keep A for now. That could be a reasonable choice. B says credit to lease obligation payable. We're not going to credit the lease obligation payable when we make the payment because we would be decreasing the lease obligation payable. The credit would be increasing it. C says a debit to the lease obligation payable, and that would be the other option. So between A and C, if we were thinking about normal like accounting for financial accounting, you would think it would be whether it be an operating lease or a capital lease. A if operating, C if capital. D then says a debit to expenditures, principal of the lease obligation. So expenditures is going to be an account that would be used in a modified accrual basis, not in the governmental activities. So which is on a normal type of accrual basis. So between A and C, we're going to be picking up C, debit to the lease obligation. Final answer, an annual lease payment on an unpaid lease obligation. So it's an unpaid lease obligation. Journal entry for the governmental activities will include a debit to the lease obligation payable, in essence reducing the payable, which would be kind of like the loan we put on the books as we capitalized, in essence, the lease. Let's take a look at the next question. An annual lease payment on an unpaid lease obligation journal entry for the debt service fund accounts will include. So similar transaction or similar question. Now, however, we're on the debt service account. So if we go through these again, we have A, a debit to expenditure, principal of lease obligation. B, credit to lease obligation payable. C, debit to lease obligation payable. D, debit to lease obligation expense. Let's go through this again using the process of elimination. An annual lease payment on an unpaid lease obligation. So we have the unpaid lease obligation, a journal entry for the debt service fund. So now we're thinking about the debt service fund as opposed to the government-wide activity. Government-wide activity is on an accrual basis. Because it's a lease obligation, we're thinking it's on the books basically as a capital lease in the government-wide type of activities. And then we want to think about, well, what's going to happen in terms of the fund type of activities? We would think then a reasonable fund would be the debt service fund, because if it was a capital lease, we're servicing, in essence, kind of a long-term liability, which is basically the lease payable that we have on the books. However, when we consider the debt service fund, although we're servicing long-term liabilities, we're on a modified accrual basis, and therefore we don't have long-term liabilities in the fund accounting. We're not recording the payable, in other words, for the lease payable. So we're going to have to be putting the activity that's happening, kind of short-term flow activity, is how we're going to record it in the debt service fund, which is one of the major groupings, which is the governmental funds, which are on the modified accrual basis. So of these accounts then, the B says a credit to the lease obligation payable. Well, we don't have a lease obligation payable because that's a long-term liability in the fund accounting. Debit to lease obligation payable, don't have that in the fund accounting. Again, and then we have a lease obligation expense. which seems more reasonable. However, we don't have expenses in the fund accounting because it's modified accrual. One of the major indications of that being the term expenditure as opposed to expense. So then the final answer is going to be A debit to expenditures, principal of lease obligation.